Welcome back, everybody, for another deep dive. This time we're looking at how security and risk management have been changing in light of all the global events that have been happening. And we have a great source for this, Michael Haughey.
Oh, yeah. He's
former police officer in both London and Hong Kong. And then he also became a consultant for risk management across Asia. So he's got a lot of really interesting insights into what the new normal for security is going to look like.
What I think is interesting is that he connects all these different things that have been happening, like the pandemic and the terrorist attacks in Europe.
Yeah.
He doesn't see them as separate things, but more like symptoms of how the world of security is changing as a whole.
Yeah, and one of the biggest things he points to is how travel restrictions from the pandemic have really changed things.
Yeah.
And, you know, we've all dealt with those in our own lives. But he's saying that they're not just an inconvenience. They're changing how security works internationally at a basic level.
Yeah, totally. He says that the old way of doing things, like multinational companies or security firms just flying in their experts to deal with a crisis,
Right.
it's just not practical anymore.
Yeah.
Like borders are closed or it's really hard to get in. So he's saying that it's more important now than ever to have these strong networks of local people.
So it's not just having people on the ground, it's about having the right people on the ground, right?
Yeah.
People who already understand what's going on locally, the laws, the culture, all that.
Exactly, yeah.
But Haughey also says that it's not just about finding good contacts. There's a whole legal side to it, too.
Yeah, absolutely. And he knows this from his own experience because he's led security operations in South Asia and Southeast Asia. He says that contracts and confidentiality agreements are really important when you're working with local partners.
Right, so everybody knows where they stand.
Exactly. It lowers the risk for both the client and the security firm. It keeps things professional and it keeps sensitive information safe.
So it makes me think, like, if you were in charge of security for a big company, could you actually respond to something that happens somewhere far away right now?
Right.
Would you have those local contacts that you already trust?
Yeah, good question.
It seems like every organization needs to be thinking about that now.
Totally. And this whole thing about limited travel also connects to another point that Haughey makes about open borders.
Yeah, that's a big one.
We all want the global economy to get going again, but opening up the borders too fast could bring the virus back and start new outbreaks.
Right, and he had some interesting examples like Singapore, New Zealand, Australia. They've all done a really good job controlling the pandemic inside their own borders, but they're very vulnerable if it comes back in from somewhere else.
It's a tough situation to be in. It's like,
Yeah.
how do you balance getting the economy going again with protecting people's health?
Right.
It's a global problem, and there's no easy answers. Haughey says it makes us think about border security and international travel in a whole new way. It's not just about visas and passports anymore. It's about managing risk when it comes to diseases.
That's such an important point. And Haughey doesn't stop there. He goes on to look at the terrorist attacks that have been happening in Europe, in France, and Austria to show how the pandemic, along with other social and political problems, is playing a part in making terrorism worse in this new era.
Right, he talks about 3 specific attacks. First, the one where a French teacher, Samuel Paty, was beheaded after showing cartoons of the Prophet Muhammad in his class.
Oh, right.
Then there were the stabbings at the Notre Dame Basilica in Nice and a shooting in Vienna. And Haughey points out that all of these were done by young people, radicalized, and often acting with very little warning.
That's what makes it so scary.
Yeah.
You just don't know when or where it's going to happen. And each of these attacks, although horrible in their own way, happened in a specific context. And Haughey says that context is really important for understanding what it means for security overall. Like, for example, the Paty case happened when there was already a lot of tension around the Charlie Hebdo trials and President Macron talking about Islam. Haughey says that this created a climate of fear and anger that made people like Paty targets.
Yeah, and what's really disturbing is how easy it is to target individuals, like Haughey says.
Yeah, it's scary.
It makes you think even doing normal everyday things could have really bad consequences in the world today.
Absolutely. And then you have the attack in Vienna, which brings up some serious concerns about how intelligence agencies are failing. And it shows a new terrorist tactic that Haughey calls scorched earth.
So to understand what scorched earth is, it's less like a regular terrorist attack and more like, imagine a wildfire spreading quickly and in unpredictable ways.
Yeah.
It's about having a lot of targets, being constantly on the move, and creating so much chaos that it's hard for law enforcement to respond.
So it's not just about how many targets there are, but how fast and how randomly they're being attacked.
Exactly.
And in the Vienna attack, there were a few times when they could have stopped it, but they missed their chance.
Yeah.
Like the attacker was known to be radicalized before. He tried to buy ammunition in Slovakia, and he was even let out of prison early.
Yeah, and Haughey uses this case to show that the tactics police usually use, which are designed for one event at a time, just aren't working against scorched earth. By the time they figure out what's going on, the damage is already done.
And in Vienna, 4 people were killed and 23 injured. So the question is, how do we change our security strategies to fight this new kind of threat?
That's the big question, right?
How do we move from just reacting to these events to stopping them before they happen?
It's a huge challenge. Haughey says we have to change how we think about it completely. We need to move away from the old ways of reacting and have a more flexible, intelligence-based approach that can adapt to how unpredictable these new threats are.
It's a lot to think about, for sure. But Haughey's experience gives us some really valuable ideas on how to handle this more and more complex world of security.
Definitely. Yeah, it really is a wake-up call. And what's interesting is Haughey doesn't just stop at the nuts and bolts of security,
Right.
He looks deeper into what causes radicalization, especially among young people. He points out that in all three of these recent attacks, the people who carried them out were late teens, early 20s.
It is pretty heartbreaking to think about these young people getting drawn into this kind of violent ideology.
Yeah.
What makes them go down that path, and how can we stop it from happening?
It's a good question. Haughey says that the old ways of gathering intelligence, listening in on communications or infiltrating groups,
Right.
they're not as effective anymore in these cases. These young people are often getting radicalized online, they're not really communicating much, and there's not a lot of planning.
So it's like trying to catch a ghost.
Yeah, pretty much.
They're not part of some big organization. They're not leaving a trail.
Right.
It makes it really tough to know what they're going to do, let alone stop them.
Exactly. And that leads to a really important point Haughey makes. We can't just keep reacting to attacks. We need to understand what causes radicalization in the first place.
So it's not just about security measures and intelligence. It's about dealing with the root causes, the social and ideological stuff that makes these young people vulnerable to extremism.
Exactly.
But how do you even start to deal with something that complicated?
It's tough, right?
Yeah.
Haughey suggests a multifaceted approach. He talks about things like community engagement, teaching critical thinking skills, and finding different paths for young people who might be drawn to radicalization. He emphasizes that this isn't just a job for the government or security agencies, it's a problem for society as a whole, and we all need to be involved in finding solutions.
So it's about building a society that can resist extremism and violence, a more resilient society.
Exactly.
And that idea of resilience, being able to adapt and bounce back from tough times, seemed to be something that keeps coming up in Haughey's analysis.
Absolutely. And it connects back to the main point of our deep dive today, which is how all these security challenges are linked together in our globalized world. Whether it's the pandemic, terrorism, or something else, we can't look at these issues in isolation anymore.
Right, it's all connected. The pandemic creates weaknesses, economic problems can lead to unrest and extremism, and technology, while offering new solutions, also creates new challenges for security.
Yeah.
It's like this ever-changing puzzle.
Exactly, and that's what makes Haughey's perspective so valuable. He's not just pointing out the problems, he's trying to find solutions. He stresses the importance of having strong local networks, adapting security strategies to counter tactics like scorched earth, and addressing the root causes of radicalization.
It's giving us a roadmap in a way.
Yeah.
It's not about living in fear. It's about educating ourselves so we can deal with this complex world better. And I think that's a key takeaway for our listeners. Knowledge is power.
Absolutely, and in the world we live in today, where everything's connected, that power comes from understanding how all these security challenges are linked together. We can't afford to be complacent. We need to be proactive, engaged, and ready to adapt as the threats keep changing.
So, as we're wrapping up this part of our deep dive, I want to leave you with a final thought. In a world where the only thing that seems certain is uncertainty, how do you define personal resilience? What steps are you taking to stay informed, prepared, and empowered in this new era of security?
It's a question worth thinking about, and hopefully this deep dive has given you some ideas to answer it. It's about realizing that security isn't just something for experts and authorities to worry about.
Right, we all have a part to play.
Yeah, whether it's being aware of our surroundings or thinking critically about what we see online, or even just having a plan in case something happens.
Like those small things can actually make a difference.
Definitely, and Haughey even talks about something as basic as duty of care.
Oh, right, for those who might not know, duty of care basically means organizations have to keep their employees safe, legally, and morally.
Yeah, and in this new world where security is getting more complicated, duty of care is even more important.
Because if a company can't just fly in a security team when things get rough, they need to have good systems in place to help and protect the people they already have there.
Right. It's about planning ahead, communicating clearly, and giving people the information they need to make good decisions about their own safety.
Which brings us back to Haughey's point about resilience. It's not just about recovering from a crisis. It's about seeing challenges coming and having the tools and knowledge to deal with them.
Absolutely. He reminds us that we live in what he calls a VUCA world.
VUCA.
Yeah, VUCA. It stands for volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous.
VUCA. I like that. It really sums up what we're talking about.
Right, and in a VUCA world, the old ways of doing security just aren't enough.
We need to be adaptable, informed, and connected.
Yeah, we need to be able to think critically, question what we believe, and be ready to change our approach as things change around us.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, I want to leave our listeners with one last question to think about.
Okay, hit me with it.
In this world where everything seems to be in flux and new threats are popping up all the time, how do you define personal resilience? What are you doing to stay informed, prepared, and empowered in this new era of security?
It's a good question to think about, and hopefully this deep dive has given you some ideas to help answer it. Thanks for listening, everybody.